Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Grandma Viola used to say that some people were born holding the map, while others were left stumbling in the dark trying to find the way. My sister Dana had been holding the map since birth, and I had spent a lifetime learning how to survive without one. She was the golden child, the first to get everything, the one whose mistakes were waved away like smoke, while mine were held against me like unshakable sins. It started when we were kids. Dana was the one who got the brand new dresses for school pictures, while I wore the hand-me-downs that never fit quite right. She was the one praised for bringing home a B+, while my straight A's were expected, nothing to be celebrated. It carried into adulthood like a sickness that never really went away, infecting every interaction, every holiday, every conversation that ended with our mother sighing and saying, "Carla, you know how Dana is." And now, standing in the dimly lit hallway of our grandmother's house, the smell of old books and faded perfume hanging thick in the air, I watched her slip the necklace over her head like it had belonged to her all along. It was a delicate thing, gold filigree and a small sapphire, not flashy but unmistakably valuable, something meant to be passed down through generations. Grandma had told me it would be mine one day, had clasped my hands in hers and whispered, "It's not about what you want, baby girl, it's about what you deserve. And one day, you'll deserve this." But Dana had taken it before the will was even read, before Grandma's body was even cold in the ground, before I had a chance to say anything that might have stopped her. She stood in front of the mirror, tilting her chin up slightly, admiring the way the sapphire caught the light, looking at herself the way a queen might admire her crown. "Looks good on me, don't you think?" she said, turning just enough to catch my reflection behind her. I should have said something right then, something biting and sharp that would make her hands tremble just enough to fumble the clasp, something that would force her to acknowledge that she wasn't entitled to every damn thing in life just because she wanted it. But I had spent too many years trying to argue against the inevitable, and in the end, I simply exhaled slowly and turned away, pretending it didn't sting. "Mom's waiting in the living room," I said instead, my voice even and controlled, the way it always was when I was swallowing something bitter. She smirked, a small, knowing thing that said she had already won. She always won. "Guess we should get this over with," she said, flipping her hair over one shoulder, the necklace glinting as she walked past me like it had been hers all along. I followed her down the hallway, past the photographs that lined the walls, the frozen moments of childhood where Dana and I stood side by side, smiling like we were equals. I wondered how many people had looked at those pictures and thought we had been close, thought we had grown up in the same world, under the same rules. The truth was, Dana had been playing with a full deck while I had been given scraps, and I had spent my entire life pretending it didn't matter. The living room was filled with the quiet murmur of distant relatives, hushed voices speaking in the respectful tones people use when death is still fresh. My mother sat on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed, a half-empty glass of wine cradled between her fingers. She looked up when Dana and I entered, but her gaze barely lingered on me before shifting to my sister, softening in the way it always did when Dana was involved. "You okay, baby?" she asked, reaching for her hand, the same way she had reached for Dana's hand every time she had ever needed comforting, every time she had ever made a mistake that needed forgiving. Dana sighed, just enough to seem appropriately mournful, just enough to make sure the attention remained squarely on her. "I'm managing," she said, squeezing my mother's fingers before dropping into the chair beside her, letting herself sink into the grief in a way that felt more like performance than anything genuine. I remained standing, my hands clasped in front of me, my presence little more than an afterthought. Aunt Lorraine cleared her throat, adjusting her reading glasses as she shuffled through a stack of papers in her lap. She had been put in charge of handling Grandma's affairs, a responsibility she seemed to take more seriously than anything else in her life. "We'll read the will tomorrow morning," she announced, glancing around the room, her eyes landing on each of us in turn. Viola was very specific about how she wanted things done, so I'd appreciate it if we could all be there on time. Of course, Dana said smoothly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The necklace caught the light again, and I saw Aunt Lorraine's eyes flicker toward it briefly before her lips pressed into a thin line. I saw it then, just a glimmer of something beneath the surface, a tiny shift in the air, a crack in the foundation that Dana didn't seem to notice. Aunt Lorraine knew. The moment passed just as quickly as it had come, and Aunt Lorraine adjusted her glasses again, clearing her throat before continuing. In the meantime, let's try to remember what today is about. Viola wouldn't have wanted any fighting. Dana hummed in agreement, resting her chin on her hand. No fighting, she echoed, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. I kept my expression neutral, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of knowing just how much she had gotten under my skin. I had let her take things from me before: attention, affection, opportunities one had never been given the chance to earn, but this time was different. This wasn't just another childhood squabble, another instance of her pulling the rug out from under me and daring me to complain about it. This was Grandma's necklace. And, even if I wasn't sure how yet, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her keep it. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a funeral home, thick and weighty like a fog that refuses to lift, filled with the unspoken expectations of grief and forced civility. I stood in the back of the room, watching as my mother clung to Dana's arm like she was the only thing keeping her upright, as if my presence barely registered in the periphery of her sorrow. The service had ended, and people were beginning to murmur in hushed tones, exchanging condolences that sounded more obligatory than heartfelt. The air smelled like carnations, cheap perfume, and the lingering remnants of old wood polished to a dull shine. Dana sat near the front, her posture perfect, her expression the perfect balance of sadness and quiet dignity, a picture of composed mourning that made my stomach churn. She was good at this, being the center of attention without making it seem like she had asked for it, soaking in the sympathetic glances of distant relatives who had always assumed she was the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who had inherited all of Grandma's best qualities. I had spent my entire life living in her shadow, watching her effortlessly step into roles that had never been offered to me, always knowing that no matter what I did, it would never be enough to shift the way people saw us. And then, as if she hadn't already taken enough, she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached up, fingers grazing the sapphire pendant that now hung around her neck, turning it slightly so that it caught the light just enough to make sure people noticed. I saw the flicker of recognition in the eyes of a few older relatives, the subtle widening of their gazes, the way their lips parted as if they wanted to say something but didn't dare. Grandma had worn that necklace for as long as I could remember, had kept it tucked beneath the collar of her blouses, had touched it absent-mindedly whenever she was deep in thought. It had been hers, a piece of history wrapped in gold and blue, something meant to be treasured, not flaunted like a trophy. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms as I forced myself to stay still, forced myself not to react the way she wanted me to. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? A test. A game she had been playing since we were children, one where she stole the pieces right off my side of the board and dared me to complain about it. I remembered the first time I had realized the rules were different for her, that we weren't playing the same game at all. I had been 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with Grandma, watching as she folded laundry with the same precision she did everything else. She had always been sharp, always known how to see through people like they were made of glass, and that day had been no different. Dana had just taken something from me, my favorite book, a worn copy of The Secret Garden that I had read so many times the pages were starting to fray. She had walked into my room, picked it up from my nightstand, and claimed it as her own, flipping through the pages with casual disinterest before tucking it under her arm and leaving without another word. When I'd gone to my mother to complain, she had simply sighed, rubbing her temples like I was exhausting her. "Carla, she just wants to borrow it," she had said dismissively. "You don't have to be so dramatic." I had sat at the table with my lips pressed together, staring down at the tabletop, pretending not to feel the lump forming in my throat. Grandma had finished folding the last towel, setting it aside before resting her hands flat on the table, her eyes steady on mine. One day, "She'll take something too far," she had said softly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "And that's when you show your teeth." I hadn't known what she had meant back then, hadn't understood the warning buried beneath the words, hadn't realized that she had seen something in Dana that no one else wanted to acknowledge. But standing in that funeral home, watching my sister wear that necklace like it had been hers all along, I finally understood. My breath was slow and measured as I unclenched my fists, forcing the tension from my shoulders. I could feel Aunt Lorraine's gaze on me from across the room, sharp and knowing, as if she was waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to call Dana out right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I turned, weaving my way through the crowd until I reached the far side of the room where the funeral director stood, speaking in hushed tones with another employee. He glanced up when he saw me approach, offering a sympathetic nod. "Ms. Reynolds," he said quietly, folding his hands in front of him. "Is there something I can do for you?" I hesitated, glancing back toward Dana for a moment before forcing my attention back to him. "When is the will reading scheduled?" He blinked, caught off guard by the question, then shifted slightly, adjusting his cuffs. "I believe your Aunt Lorraine is handling that," he said carefully. "But from what I understand, it should be tomorrow morning at her office." I nodded, the pieces clicking into place. Tomorrow morning. That meant Dana had less than 24 hours left to wear that necklace with such confidence, to act like she had already won. The thought settled something inside me, cooled the anger burning beneath my skin, replaced it with something quieter, sharper. When I turned to leave, I caught Dana watching me from across the room, her head tilted slightly, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She had won every battle between us for as long as I could remember, had always known how to tilt the board in her favor before I had even made my first move. But this time, she had taken something that wasn't hers, and she had done it in front of too many people who knew the truth. She thought she had already won. But the game wasn't over yet. The air inside Aunt Lorraine's office was thick with the scent of old paper, wood polish, and something faintly floral, like perfume that had settled too deeply into the furniture after years of routine. I sat in a stiff-backed chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the faint rustle of documents being shuffled on the desk. Dana sat across from me, legs crossed, posture perfect, fingers absent-mindedly grazing the sapphire necklace at her throat as though it had belonged to her for years instead of mere hours. She wasn't looking at me, but she didn't need to. The smug curve of her lips told me everything I needed to know. She was comfortable, she was confident, and in her mind, she had already won. Aunt Lorraine adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and gave a long sigh that seemed to settle deep in her bones before she spoke. "I want to remind everyone that Viola was very clear in her final wishes," she said, her voice even, her tone one of quiet authority. "She spent a great deal of time ensuring that her estate was handled exactly as she intended, and I expect there will be no arguing over the terms laid out in this document." Dana let out a soft breath, the kind of exaggerated exhale that made it clear she was only half listening, her fingers still absently playing with the pendant against her chest. "I don't see what the big deal is," she said, her voice light, feigning indifference. "We all know how this is going to go, right? I mean, it's not like there's anything here to fight over." Aunt Lorraine's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something quiet and calculating, something that made the smallest sliver of doubt creep into my sister's features. She hesitated, barely, but enough that I noticed. "That's an interesting assumption," Aunt Lorraine said mildly, flipping open the thick envelope in front of her. "But let's see what Viola actually had to say, shall we?" The room was silent except for the sound of papers shifting, the soft scratch of Lorraine's fingertip running down the first page as she found her place. I kept my breathing steady, my face impassive, even as my pulse quickened, anticipation settling like a weight in my stomach. Dana had taken the necklace without hesitation, had walked into the funeral home wearing it like she had every right to, had smirked when I didn't object, thinking that my silence meant surrender. But I had learned a long time ago that real victories weren't always won in the moment, they were earned in the long game. Lorraine adjusted her glasses again and began to read. I, Viola May Reynolds, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this my last will and testament. It is my wish that my estate be divided according to the conditions I have set forth, with the understanding that my family's legacy is more than just property. It is responsibility, history, and tradition. As such, my most valuable possessions are not simply to be claimed, but to be earned. There was a pause as Lorraine flipped the page, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. Dana shifted slightly, her expression faltering just a fraction, her brows knitting together in the smallest flicker of discomfort. Lorraine's voice remained steady as she continued. To my granddaughter Dana Reynolds, I leave the family necklace, an heirloom passed down through generations, a symbol of strength, resilience, and duty. However, she paused for a beat, glancing over the rim of her glasses at Dana, whose lips had just begun to part as if to interject. This inheritance comes with a condition. Dana blinked, straightening in her chair, her hand instinctively tightening around the sapphire at her throat. A condition? She repeated, her tone suddenly sharper, the false ease she had carried into the room beginning to crack. Aunt Lorraine didn't look up this time, continuing as though Dana hadn't spoken at all. The necklace is not merely a piece of jewelry, it is a symbol of the Reynolds family's legacy. As such, whoever wears it must uphold that legacy by fulfilling one final request made by Viola before her passing. Dana let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking her head slightly. Oh, come on, she scoffed. What kind of request are we even talking about here? This is ridiculous. Lorraine met her gaze evenly. The person who wears the necklace, she said, must also take ownership of Viola's lake house and reside there for no less than 1 full year. During that time, they must host monthly family dinners, ensuring that the home remains a gathering place for the Reynolds family, as it has been for generations. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Dana blinked once, twice, and then let out another hollow laugh, her hand dropping from the necklace as if it had suddenly become something foreign against her skin. That's insane, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. You're telling me I have to move into some old house and play hostess just to keep this? Lorraine didn't blink. That is correct. Dana's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, as if she were trying to form a rebuttal but couldn't quite grasp the right words. And what happens if I don't? She finally demanded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Aunt Lorraine let the question hang in the air for a long moment before she spoke. If you refuse or fail to meet the conditions, she said smoothly, then the necklace, along with full ownership of the lake house, will transfer to the next named heir. Dana's lips parted again, but this time, no words came out. I didn't move, didn't react, didn't let even a flicker of emotion cross my face as Aunt Lorraine turned the page, her voice calm, deliberate, unwavering. That heir, she continued, is Carla Reynolds. The world seemed to slow, the weight of the words pressing into the space between us, thick and unshakable. Dana swallowed, her gaze snapping toward me, searching my face for something, shock, hesitation, uncertainty, but I gave her nothing. For the first time in my life, Dana had been given something that came with an expectation, a burden, a responsibility she had never wanted, and for the first time, she was the one who had to prove she was worthy of it. I didn't have to take the necklace back. I just had to wait for her to drop it. The lake house sat at the edge of a dense stretch of trees, the water dark and still, the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides and made everything feel heavier than it should. Dana had driven up alone, refusing help, insisting she could handle everything on her own, convinced that this was nothing more than an inconvenience she had to suffer through in order to keep what she had taken. She had spent her whole life winning without effort, collecting prizes she never had to fight for, and I knew that in her mind, this was no different. She would move in, throw a few obligatory dinners, play the role of devoted granddaughter until the year was up, and then she would walk away with both the necklace and the deed, victorious as always. But Grandma's house was not a prize to be claimed, and Dana had no idea what she had really walked into. She had been expecting something charming and picturesque, some quaint little retreat by the water, the kind of place people went to unwind. the kind of place she could pretend to love just long enough to secure her inheritance. Instead, she found a house that had been frozen in time, untouched since the last time Grandma had walked its halls, heavy with history that refused to fade. The wallpaper in the entryway was faded and peeling at the corners, the floors creaked no matter how lightly she stepped, and the scent of old wood and dust clung to every surface, as if the house itself refused to let go of the past. She had barely been there a week before the complaints started. The first time she called me, her voice was clipped, irritated, full of the forced patience of someone who was already regretting every decision that had led her to this point. "The heating system in this place is ancient," she said, her frustration barely masked. "And the floors make so much noise it's impossible to sneak around without waking the dead." I had hummed in response, noncommittal, letting her vent, letting her feel like she was in control of the conversation. "Sounds like you're settling in," I had said, my voice deliberately even, knowing that nothing irritated her more than the idea that I wasn't taking her complaints seriously. "I'm sure you'll have it all figured out soon enough." She had scoffed, but she hadn't argued, and when she hung up, I knew she had been expecting me to offer some kind of sympathy, some sign that I was jealous or resentful, but I gave her nothing. By the time the first family dinner rolled around, Dana had already begun to fray at the edges. She put on a good show, of course, dressed impeccably, smiled at all the right moments, made polite conversation with the aunts and uncles who had come out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. But the exhaustion was there, lurking beneath the surface, bleeding into the way she held herself, the way she rubbed her temples when she thought no one was looking. The house was getting to her. "Have you noticed anything strange?" Aunt Lorraine had asked midway through dinner, her fork hovering over her plate, her gaze sharp and calculating. Dana had frozen for half a second, the kind of barely perceptible hesitation that only someone who knew her as well as I did would have caught. "Strange how?" she had asked, her voice measured, guarded. Lorraine had taken a slow sip of wine before setting her glass down carefully. "I don't know," she had said, tilting her head slightly. "It just feels different, doesn't it? Like she never really left." Dana had forced a laugh, too loud, too forced, her fingers tightening around her napkin. "It's just an old house," she had said, her tone dismissive, but her knee had been bouncing beneath the table, a tell she had never been able to control. "Creaky floors, weird noises, bad lighting, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and she knew it. The second month was worse. The family dinners became smaller, the invitations met with vague excuses, with hesitant declines, as though people were looking for reasons not to come. Dana had started losing sleep, the shadows under her eyes darkening with each passing day, her frustration turning into something sharper, something angrier. And then she found the letters. She had been searching for a spare set of sheets in the upstairs closet when she noticed a small wooden box tucked away in the back, nearly hidden behind an old stack of yellowed newspapers. She had pulled it out, dust covering her fingertips as she pried it open, expecting to find nothing more than forgotten trinkets, old receipts, maybe even one of Grandma's half-finished crossword puzzles. But instead, she found letters. Neatly folded, the paper slightly brittle with age, each one addressed to me in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting. She had stared at them for a long moment, her pulse loud in her ears, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly the paper threatened to tear. And then she had opened the first one, her eyes scanning the words, her breath catching somewhere between disbelief and dread. "If she's reading this, then she stole what was yours. But don't worry, revenge, my dear, can be patient." The room had seemed colder after that. She had searched the house after that, desperate, frantic, pulling open drawers, yanking books from shelves, overturning cushions as if somewhere beneath the dust and old memories, she would find something that would put her back in control. And then, finally, she found the locked door. It was in the back hallway, the one no one ever used, the one that had always felt strangely separate from the rest of the house. The door was heavy, the kind that didn't belong in a home, but rather in a place meant to keep things locked away, meant to hold secrets that weren't meant to see the light of day. The key was in the bottom drawer of Grandma's old writing desk, tucked beneath a stack of papers that smelled like time and ink. Her hands had trembled when she slid it into the lock, her breath shallow, her pulse erratic. The door swung open with a low creak, revealing a room that had been untouched for years, the walls lined with photographs, letters, documents, an entire history that had been carefully hidden away. And there, sitting on the desk in the center of the room, was the one thing that could destroy her completely. A signed document. A legal record. Proof that she had forged Grandma's signature years ago, altering financial documents, stealing something that had never belonged to her. Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the paper, her mind racing, her stomach twisting. I already knew. And now, so did she. The air in the lake house was thick with the weight of something unspoken, something heavy that had settled into the walls, into the floors, into the very foundation of the house itself, like rock creeping in from the inside. Dana sat at the old wooden table, her hands flat against the surface, her fingers splayed out as if bracing herself against an invisible force, her nails digging into the grain of the wood. Her breathing was uneven, shallow, her posture rigid, every muscle in her body coiled tight as though she were waiting for a blow that had yet to land. The document she had found still sat in front of her, the paper slightly crumpled at the edges from the way she had gripped it too tightly, as if holding it any looser would allow the truth to slip away. I stood across from her, my arms crossed loosely over my chest, my expression carefully composed, giving her nothing, offering no hint of sympathy or anger, just quiet certainty that cut through the silence like a blade. She hadn't spoken since I had walked in, since I had taken my time closing the door behind me, since I had let my gaze flicker deliberately to the paper in front of her before meeting her eyes. She had always been good at controlling a room, at making sure the conversation bent to her will, but this time was different. This time, she had no control at all. "You knew," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, hoarse and uneven, her throat tight with something that could have been fear, could have been desperation, could have been the slow, creeping realization that for the first time in her life, she had truly lost. I tilted my head slightly, watching her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm before I finally spoke. "Of course I knew," I said, my voice calm, measured, completely unshaken by the storm that was raging behind her eyes. "I knew before Grandma even finished writing those letters. I knew before she ever told me to be patient. I knew the moment you took that necklace without even asking what it meant, without even considering that maybe, just maybe, it was never yours to take." She swallowed hard, her fingers curling inward, nails pressing into her palms, her lips parting like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to say something that would shift the balance of power back in her favor. But there was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo what she had done, nothing that could erase the truth that had already been written in ink. I stepped forward slowly, reaching down to pick up the paper, turning it over in my hands, my gaze skimming the familiar signature at the bottom, the ink slightly smudged in a way that no real signature should have been. "This," I said, holding it up between two fingers, watching her flinch ever so slightly at the sight of it, "is proof that you forged Grandma's signature on financial documents, that you moved money out of accounts that weren't yours, that you took something that didn't belong to you and thought no one would ever find out." Her breath hitched, her chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked movements, her eyes darting toward the door as though she were considering running, as though she thought there was still a way out of this. But there wasn't. There never had been. "I made copies," I continued, my voice never wavering, my tone cool and even, watching as the last bit of color drained from her face. "And I sent them to the family lawyer this morning. So even if you somehow thought you could bury this, even if you thought you could talk your way out of it like you always do, it's already too late." Dana let out a strangled sound, something caught between a laugh and a sob, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You wouldn't," she said, her voice thick with disbelief, her eyes pleading, desperate, searching for some hint of weakness in me that she could latch onto. "Carla, please, this could ruin me." I leaned forward, resting my palms on the table, meeting her gaze with something steady and unrelenting, something that told her there was no room left for negotiation. "You ruined yourself," I said simply, the words landing with the force of something final, something irreversible. Her breathing turned ragged, her shoulders shaking, her hands clenching into fists before she suddenly let out a sharp, bitter laugh, the sound hollow and humorless. "Is this what you wanted?" She spat, her voice raw, angry, a desperate attempt to regain control of something that was already gone. "You wanted to destroy me? You wanted to watch me lose everything?" I exhaled slowly, straightening up, my expression unreadable. "No," I said, shaking my head, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "I never wanted to take anything from you, Dana. I just wanted you to live with it. I wanted you to live with the weight of the things you stole, with the knowledge that none of it ever really belonged to you, with the reality that even after all of this, you still have to wear that necklace and know it was never supposed to be yours." She flinched at that, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch the sapphire at her throat, her fingers trembling as though she could already feel the weight of it dragging her down. I turned, walking toward the door, my fingers grazing the frame as I paused for just a moment, glancing back at her one last time. "Keep the necklace," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying every ounce of finality she needed to hear. "But I'm keeping the original deed. And I'm keeping the letters. And no matter what happens next, you'll know the truth, and so will I." Dana didn't say a word as I stepped outside, the cold night air biting against my skin, the wind carrying the scent of the lake, of damp earth, of something old finally settling into place. I walked away without looking back, knowing that she would stay there, alone in that house, with nothing but the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders, with nothing but the sound of the creaking floors and the whisper of the past reminding her that sometimes the things you take will take something from you in return. Because sometimes revenge isn't about taking something back. It's about making sure the person who stole it knows they never really had it in the first place.